The first gunshot shattered the twilight silence of Sierra Falls, but it was the second that changed Tess Abernathy's life forever. Blood bloomed across William's chest like a cruel desert flower as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock before the light in them dimmed forever. She hadn't loved him, not truly, but he'd been her only lifeline in this desolate corner of Arizona territory. 1878. Now he lay dead on the dusty Main Street, and the three men who'd killed him were already forgetting his existence as they turned their attention to her. "Looks like old Bill left us something pretty," the tallest one said, tobacco juice staining his unkempt beard. His companions laughed, the sound scraping against Tess's ears like rusty nails. Tess backed away, the newly purchased calico dress William had insisted she wear now feeling like a prison. Her pulse hammered in her throat as she calculated the distance to the nearest building. 20 steps, maybe more. Too far. "I'm not anyone's to claim," she said, forcing steel into her voice despite the fear constricting her chest. "William owed you money. I had nothing to do with his debts." The bearded man spat into the dirt. "Way I see it, you're the only thing of value he left behind. Consider yourself payment." The crowd that had gathered at the sound of gunfire now dispersed, doors closing, shutters dropping. Sierra Falls had decided this wasn't their business. Nobody would help the gambling man's woman, especially not one with Tess's questionable past. 7 days later, Tess staggered through the scrubland, her lips cracked and bleeding, her once fine dress torn and filthy. She'd escaped in the night while her captors lay in drunken stupors, stealing a canteen and what little food she could carry. The desert stretched endlessly around her, the merciless June sun beating down upon her sunburned skin. Her vision blurred as she forced herself forward, one painful step after another. She thought she was hallucinating when she saw the rider on the horizon, the silhouette wavering in the heat like a mirage. Tess had never been one to pray, but she found herself whispering wordless pleas to a god she wasn't sure existed. The rider grew larger, more substantial, real. The last of her strength abandoned her, and she collapsed to her knees in the parched earth. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. Through the haze of dehydration and exhaustion, she glimpsed a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, concern etched into lines around clear blue eyes. "Easy now," a deep voice murmured. "I've got you. They'll find me," she managed to rasp. "Not while I'm breathing," the stranger said, his tone carrying such quiet certainty that Tess, against all her hard-learned lessons of distrust, believed him. As consciousness slipped away, she heard his final words, spoken not to her but seemingly to the vast, uncaring sky. "I'll keep you. Forever if need be." When Tess awoke, the world had transformed. Instead of harsh sunlight, she lay in cool dimness. A rough, wooden ceiling replaced the endless blue sky. The scent of coffee and something savory floated in the air, replacing the acrid smell of desert dust. Her parched throat had been soothed, though it still ached with each swallow. "Welcome back," said the same deep voice she remembered from the desert. Tess turned her head to find the stranger sitting in a chair beside the narrow bed where she lay. In the lantern light, she could see him clearly, tall and broad-shouldered even while seated, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the sky just before dusk. His dark hair, streaked with strands of silver at the temples, was cut short, and a beard shadowed his jawline. Not the unkempt whiskers of her captors, but neatly trimmed. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a painful whisper. "Mesquite Creek Ranch. My ranch." He stood and brought a tin cup of water to her lips. "Small place about 15 miles from where I found you. Name's Mason Blackwood." She drank gratefully before asking, "How long have I been here?" 2 days. You were in bad shape. Mrs. Ortiz, my housekeeper, she helped tend to you." He studied her face. "You want to tell me what happened to you, Miss Abernathy, Tess Abernathy?" She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Men in her experience wanted something in return for their kindness. "My companion was killed in Sierra Falls. The men who killed him decided I was part of their payment." Mason's expression hardened. "Donovan's gang?" Tess nodded, surprised. "You know them? Know of them?" "They've been causing trouble all through the territory." He set the cup aside. "They hurt you?" The question was gentle, but Tess flinched nonetheless. "I got away before the worst could happen." Mason nodded, not pressing further. "You're safe here. Once you're stronger, I can take you wherever you need to go." "I don't have anywhere," Tess admitted, the words cutting like glass in her throat. She'd never been so nakedly honest with a stranger, but something about Mason Blackwood's steady gaze made lies seem futile. He considered this, his expression unreadable. "Then you'll stay here until you figure things out. No obligations, no expectations. Just a safe place to heal." Tess wanted to believe him, but experience had taught her harsh lessons about men's charity. "Why would you do that for someone you don't know?" Mason stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gathering dusk. "My mother used to say that kindness doesn't need reasons." He turned back to her, his face half in shadow. "Get some rest, Miss Abernathy. We can talk more tomorrow." After he left, Tess lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch house. Somewhere a clock ticked steadily. Wind whispered around the eaves. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack. She didn't trust Mason Blackwood's kindness, couldn't afford to, but for tonight, at least, she was safe. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. Tonight she would allow herself the luxury of rest. The next week passed in a blur of gradual recovery. Mrs. Ortiz, a plump, no-nonsense Mexican woman in her 50s, cared for Tess with brisk efficiency and surprising gentleness. She brought nourishing food, helped Tess bathe, and provided clean, simple clothes that had belonged to Mason's sister, who apparently lived back east. Mason himself was often absent during daylight hours, tending to the business of running his ranch. When he was present, he was unfailingly polite but maintained a careful distance. He asked no prying questions, demanded no explanations for how a woman like her had ended up in William's company, or what she had done before. On the 8th day, Tess ventured outside for the first time. The ranch house sat on a modest rise, overlooking a shallow valley where cottonwoods clustered along a creek. Beyond stretched grassland dotted with mesquite and sage, rolling toward distant purple mountains. Several outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, and smokehouse stood nearby, and corrals held horses that watched her with mild curiosity. She stood on the porch, breathing deeply of air scented with dust and greenery rather than the stale whiskey and smoke she'd grown accustomed to in the saloons and gambling halls where William had plied his trade. "It's not much," Mason said, appearing silently beside her, "but it's mine." "It's beautiful," Tess replied honestly. After years of rented rooms and transient living, the permanence of Mesquite Creek felt almost otherworldly. "How are you feeling?" he asked, leaning against the porch rail. "Better. Strong enough to earn my keep." She met his gaze directly. "I won't be a charity case, Mr. Blackwood." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "Mason, please, and there's plenty of work if you're set on it. Mrs. Ortiz could use help with the cooking and mending." "I'm not much of a cook," Tess admitted, "but I can learn, and I'm good with figures." "William always had me keep his accounts." Mason seemed to consider this. "I could use help with the books. Mine are a mess, and the bank in Silver Bend is getting impatient for proper records." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Tess felt a flicker of purpose. "I can do that." That afternoon, Mason showed her to a small room off the main living area that served as an office. Ledgers and receipts were stacked haphazardly on a scarred oak desk, and a layer of dust covered everything. "Told you it was a mess," Mason said, looking almost sheepish. Tess rolled up her sleeves. "I've seen worse." She spent the rest of the day organizing the chaos, creating separate piles for receipts, correspondence, and bank notices. By supper time, she had a clearer picture of Mesquite Creek's finances, and they weren't good. The ranch was making enough to survive, but barely. A bad season could tip everything into ruin. At dinner, she hesitated to mention her findings. It wasn't her place to comment on Mason's business. "Something on your mind?" he asked, noticing her silence. Tess set down her fork. "Your ledgers. They show the ranch is barely breaking even." Mason sighed, not appearing surprised or offended. "Been that way since my father died 3 years ago. I was away fighting Indians for the army when he took sick. By the time I made it home, he was gone and the ranch was mortgaged to the hilt." "You could sell more cattle," Tess suggested. "Could if I had more to sell. Most of our breeding stock was sold off to cover my father's debts." He shook his head. "I've been building the herd back slowly, but it takes time we might not have. The bank notice I saw mentioned foreclosure if the next payment isn't made." Mason nodded grimly. 3 weeks from now. I've got most of it, but I'm still short by about $200. Tess thought of the small leather pouch hidden in the lining of her torn dress, her emergency fund, containing $27 and a gold locket that might fetch another 15. Not nearly enough to help. "There must be something that can be done," she said. "I've got a few ideas." Mason's tone suggested he didn't want to discuss them further. "Don't worry yourself about it. You focus on getting well." That night, Tess lay awake, turning over Mesquite Creek's financial problems in her mind. She owed Mason her life. The least she could do was try to help save his ranch. But how? She had few skills beyond keeping books and separating men from their money across card tables, neither of which would raise $200 in 3 weeks. The next morning, as she continued organizing Mason's papers, she discovered a deed to a small silver mine in the hills east of the ranch. According to the documents, Mason's father had purchased it years ago, but it had never produced enough ore to be profitable. When Mason returned from checking fence lines that afternoon, Tess showed him what she'd found. "The Silverado mine," he frowned. "That old hole in the ground was one of my father's follies. We tried working it for a while after I came home, but there wasn't enough silver to justify the effort." "Did you have it properly assessed?" Tess asked. "William knew a mining engineer who told us that some properties are abandoned too quickly. Sometimes the real veins are just a little deeper than most are willing to dig." Mason raised an eyebrow. "You know about mining." "I know about men and their dreams," Tess replied. "And I know that sometimes dreams need a second look before you throw them away." 2 days later, they rode out to the abandoned mine, accompanied by Tomas, Mason's most experienced ranch hand. The entrance was half collapsed, but after a few hours of clearing debris, they were able to enter safely. Mason led the way, holding a lantern high. "My father sank everything into this place for a while," he explained as they moved deeper into the tunnel. "We found some silver, but never enough to cover costs." They reached the end of the main shaft where a crude wooden platform marked where the digging had stopped. Mason held the lantern higher, illuminating the rock face. Tomas ran his hand over the stone, his weathered face thoughtful. "Senor Blackwood, did your father ever have someone check this wall, just himself?" "Why? My father was a silver miner in Sonora." Tomas pointed to faint gleaming threads barely visible in the rock. "This pattern. It reminds me of what he called the spider's web. Sometimes it means a larger deposit nearby." Hope flickered in Mason's eyes. "Are you sure?" "No, patron, but it might be worth bringing someone who knows more than I do." Mason turned to Tess, his expression softening in the lantern light. "Looks like your instincts were right, Miss Abernathy." The ride back to the ranch was charged with cautious optimism. If there was silver to be found, it could solve Mason's financial troubles. But mining required investment they didn't have, and the bank wouldn't wait for uncertain returns. "I might know someone who could help," Tess said as they unsaddled the horses back at the ranch. "A man William knew in Silver Bend, Theodore Hammond. He invests in mining operations." Mason's expression closed. "Hammond is the one for closing on my ranch." Tess's heart sank. "I didn't realize." "He's been trying to get his hands on Mesquite Creek for years. My father always refused to sell, even when times were hard." Mason's jaw tightened. "Hammond's not the type to help us find silver just to lose the land he's about to claim." "Then we need to find another investor," Tess insisted. "Someone who'd be willing to take a chance on the mine in exchange for a share of the profits." "In 3 weeks," Mason shook his head. "People with that kind of money don't make decisions that quickly. Some do if the stakes are high enough." Tess hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I could go to Silver Bend. There's a high-stakes poker game at the Golden Palace every Saturday night, if I could get a seat at that table." Mason stared at her. "You're suggesting you gamble for the money we need." "I'm good at cards, Mason. Very good. It's how William and I survived for years." "And if you lose?" "I won't." She met his gaze steadily. "William wasn't a good gambler, but he was an excellent teacher. He taught me every trick, every tell. I can do this." Mason studied her face for a long moment. "It's too dangerous. Donovan and his men might be in Silver Bend. And those high-stakes games, they're no place for a woman." "I've been in worse places," Tess said quietly. "And as for danger, I've been living with it since I was 16. "Is that when you met William?" Tess nodded, memories washing over her. "My father was a preacher in Kansas. When he died, there was nothing left. No money, no family. William was passing through town and he offered me a way out." She gave a bitter smile. "He wasn't a good man, but he never pretended to be, and he taught me to survive." Mason was silent for a long moment. "I won't risk your safety for my ranch." "It's not your decision to make," Tess replied. "I owe you my life, Mason. Let me do this." That evening they argued late into the night, their voices carrying through the ranch house until Mrs. Ortiz pointedly closed doors and cleared her throat. Finally, a compromise was reached. Tess would go to Silver Bend, but not alone. Mason would accompany her, posing as a cattle buyer from Texas. They would stay only long enough for Tess to play in the Saturday night game, then return to Mesquite Creek regardless of the outcome. 3 days later they arrived in Silver Bend, a bustling mining town nestled in a narrow valley. Unlike the ramshackle Sierra Falls, Silver Bend boasted proper wooden sidewalks, a brick bank, and even a small opera house. The Golden Palace stood at the center of town, its gilt-edged windows and red velvet curtains proclaiming its status as the finest establishment in the territory. They took rooms at a modest hotel on the edge of town, careful to maintain the fiction that they were traveling separately. Tess wore a green silk dress she'd purchased in the town's only dress shop, an extravagance that had made her wince, but a necessary one. No one would allow her into the high-stakes game looking like a ranch hand's wife. "I still don't like this plan," Mason said as he escorted her to the Golden Palace that evening. In his black suit and string tie, with his beard trimmed and hair slicked back, he looked like a different man, a prosperous businessman rather than a struggling rancher. "You don't have to like it," Tess replied, adjusting her gloves. "You just have to trust me." The Golden Palace hummed with activity. Well-dressed men and painted women moved through the ornate rooms, their laughter mingling with the clink of glasses and the rattle of dice. At the far end of the main floor, a raised platform held several card tables where serious gamblers played. Tess approached the floor manager, a thin man with oiled hair and calculating eyes. "I'd like to join the private game," she said, her voice carrying the cultured accent she'd perfected years ago. The man looked her up and down. "The private game has $1,000 buy-in, madam." "I'm aware." Tess opened her reticule and counted out the money, nearly all of Mason's savings, plus what she'd managed to scrape together. "I believe this will suffice." The manager's eyebrows rose slightly. "Follow me." Mason caught her arm before she could leave. "Be careful," he murmured. Tess offered him a confident smile she didn't entirely feel. "I always am." The private room was dim and thick with cigar smoke. 5 men sat around a green baize table, their faces illuminated by the hanging lamp above. They looked up as Tess entered, expressions ranging from amusement to irritation. "Gentlemen," the floor manager announced, "Mrs. Williams would like to join your game." The oldest player, a white-haired man with a diamond stickpin, frowned. "This is no place for a lady." "Then it's fortunate I'm merely a woman who enjoys cards," Tess replied smoothly, taking the empty chair without waiting for further invitation. "Shall we begin?" For the first hour, Tess played cautiously, losing small amounts to establish herself as a mediocre player. She studied her opponents. The old man with the diamond pin was conservative, betting only on strong hands. A red-faced cattle buyer played recklessly when drinking. A pale young man in an expensive suit bluffed too often. A silent Mexican with steady hands rarely entered a pot unless his cards were good. And a broad-shouldered miner with a scar across his cheek played unpredictably. As the night progressed, Tess began to win small pots at first, then larger ones. She kept her expression neutral, her hands steady, even as the stack of chips before her grew. The men's attitudes shifted from condescension to wariness. "Where did you learn to play, Mrs. Williams?" The young man asked after Tess won a substantial pot with 3 queens. "My late husband was fond of the game," she replied, stacking her chips precisely. "I watched and learned." "Lucky man, your husband," the miner commented. "Not lucky enough," Tess said with a small smile. "He's dead." The hours blurred together. Players came and went, but Tess remained, her concentration absolute. By midnight, she'd quadrupled her initial stake. By 2 in the morning, she had nearly $8,000 before her, more than enough to save Mesquite Creek. It was time to leave. She knew from experience that fortune could turn in an instant. Tess collected her winnings, thanked the table with gracious courtesy, and made her way back to the main floor where Mason waited, his face lighting with relief when he saw her. "Let's go," she murmured as she reached him. Quickly and quietly. They were halfway to the door when a familiar voice froze Tess's blood. "Well, look who it is. Bill's little card sharp." She turned slowly to find herself facing Donovan, the bearded leader of the men who'd held her captive. His 2 companions flanked him, their expressions predatory. Mason stepped slightly in front of Tess. "The lady is with me." Donovan's gaze flicked to Mason, dismissing him. "The lady, as you call her, belongs to me. She ran off with something that wasn't hers." "I took nothing but what was mine to begin with," Tess said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Way I see it, you were payment for a debt." Donovan's hand moved to the gun at his hip. "And I aim to collect." Mason's voice remained calm, but Tess could feel the tension radiating from him. "There won't be any collecting tonight. The lady is leaving with me." The standoff held for a breathless moment. Around them, other patrons sensed the danger and moved away, creating a circle of empty space. "You willing to die for a used-up card cheat?" Donovan asked Mason. Are you willing to die trying to take what isn't yours? Mason countered. His hand hadn't moved toward his own gun, but something in his stance spoke of lethal capability. Donovan hesitated, perhaps recognizing the quiet confidence of a man who knew how to handle himself. His eyes narrowed. "This ain't over." "Yes, it is," Mason replied. "The lady is under my protection now, permanently." The silent promise of violence in his tone must have convinced Donovan, who finally stepped back. "Your funeral," he muttered, gesturing for his companions to follow him to the bar. Outside, the night air was cool and clean after the stuffiness of the gambling hall. Tess's legs trembled as the tension drained from her. "Are you all right?" Mason asked, his hand warm on her elbow. "Yes, thank you." She clutched her reticule, heavy with winnings. "We should leave town tonight." Mason nodded. "I'll get the horses." They rode through the darkness, pushing hard until dawn painted the eastern sky with pale gold. Only then did they stop to rest in a sheltered arroyo, letting the horses drink from a small spring. "You were magnificent in there," Mason said as they shared jerky and hardtack. "I've never seen anyone handle cards like that." Tess smiled tiredly. "Years of practice. William may have been a scoundrel, but he was right about one thing: people see what they expect to see. They saw a woman out of her depth, so that's what I showed them." "Until you didn't." Mason's eyes crinkled at the corners. "How much did we win?" "Almost $8,000. Tess couldn't keep the pride from her voice. "More than enough to pay off the bank and have capital left for the mine." Mason stared at her in astonishment. 8,000? Tess, that's a fortune." "It's freedom," she corrected gently. "For Mesquite Creek, for you." Something shifted in Mason's expression, a softening, a warmth. "For us maybe, if you wanted to stay." The words hung in the air between them, laden with possibility. Tess looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Mason, you don't know everything about me. The things I've done, I know enough," he interrupted. "I know you're brave and clever and kind. I know you risked everything to help save my ranch, even though you owed me nothing." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "The past is gone, Tess. It's what we do now that matters." When she finally looked up, his face was close to hers, his eyes searching her own. "Why did you really help me?" She whispered. "Because from the moment I found you in the desert, something told me you were meant to be part of my life." His hand gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I meant what I said to Donovan. You're under my protection now, for as long as you want to be." The distance between them disappeared as his lips found hers, gentle at first, then with growing certainty. Tess had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such tender respect, as if she were something precious rather than something to be used. When they finally parted, breathless and dizzy, Tess rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in years, perhaps in her entire life, she felt truly safe. "We should get back to the ranch," Mason said after a long moment. "Make sure everything's secure before Donovan decides to come looking for trouble." They reached Mesquite Creek by nightfall, weary but triumphant. Mrs. Ortiz exclaimed over their dusty appearance and insisted on feeding them before they could even wash the trail from their faces. As they ate her hearty stew, Tess and Mason recounted their adventure, carefully edited for Mrs. Ortiz's benefit. The next morning, Mason rode to Silver Bend to pay off the bank loan. Tess spent the day with Mrs. Ortiz, learning to make tortillas and listening to stories about the ranch in better days. When Mason returned that evening, his face was alight with relief and something like wonder. "It's done," he announced as he entered the kitchen where Tess and Mrs. Ortiz were preparing supper. "The loan is paid, with enough left over to hire a proper mining engineer for the Silverado." Mrs. Ortiz crossed herself and murmured a prayer of thanks. Tess smiled, happiness bubbling up inside her. That's wonderful news. Later, as dusk settled over the ranch, Mason found Tess on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I have something for you," he said, sitting beside her on the bench. He placed a small wooden box in her hands. "Open it." Inside lay a silver key, simple but beautifully crafted. Tess looked at him questioningly. "It's the key to Mesquite Creek," Mason explained. "To the house, the land, everything. I had it made in town today." "Mason, I don't understand." He took her hands in his expression earnest. "What I'm trying to say, poorly, is that I want you to stay. Not as my guest or my employee, but as my partner. In everything." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "I know it's sudden. We've only known each other a few weeks, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Tess's heart pounded against her ribs. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," he said simply. "I am. I love you, Tess Abernathy. I think I've loved you since I found you in the desert, and if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel cast aside again." Tears blurred Tess's vision. "I've never had a real home," she whispered. "Never belonged anywhere or to anyone who truly cared for me." "You do now," Mason said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll keep you, Tess, forever." "Yes," she said, the word carrying all the hope and fear and joy that filled her heart. "Yes, I'll stay. I'll marry you." His kiss tasted of promise and new beginnings. Behind them, Mrs. Ortiz discreetly closed the front door, giving them privacy under the vast, star-filled sky. 3 days later, a mining engineer from Silver Bend confirmed Tomas's suspicions. The Silverado mine showed strong indicators of a significant silver deposit just beyond where Mason's father had stopped digging. With proper equipment and manpower, they could reach it within months. Life at Mesquite Creek took on a rhythm that Tess had never experienced before, the steady pulse of honest work and shared purpose. She continued to manage the books, discovering a talent for business that surprised even herself. Under her guidance, the ranch began selling beef directly to mining camps at premium prices, rather than to middlemen who skimmed the profits. Mason divided his time between the ranch and the mine, working alongside the men he hired, his confidence growing as both operations prospered. In the evenings, he and Tess would sit on the porch, planning their future as the sky turned from blue to purple to black. They were married on a crisp October day, with the cottonwoods along the creek blazing gold against the blue sky. The ceremony was small, just the ranch hands, Mrs. Ortiz and her family, and a circuit-riding preacher who happened through the area. Tess wore a simple ivory dress ordered from San Francisco, and Mason donned a new black suit that made him look, in Mrs. Ortiz's words, "my guapo." As they exchanged vows beneath an arch of autumn branches, Tess felt the past finally release its hold on her. The frightened girl who had fled with William, the hardened woman who had survived by her wits in gambling halls, they were parts of her still, but no longer all of her. Now she was also Mrs. Mason Blackwood, mistress of Mesquite Creek Ranch, a woman with a future as vast as the Arizona sky. Their wedding night was a revelation. Mason's tenderness as he undressed her, his reverent touch as he explored her body, showed Tess that physical love could be beautiful rather than merely transactional. In his arms, she discovered parts of herself she'd never known existed, depths of passion and vulnerability that left her breathless and amazed. "I never thought I could feel this way," she confessed in the quiet darkness afterward, her head pillowed on his chest. "Like I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Mason's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That's because you are. We both are." November brought the first significant strike at the Silverado mine, a vein of high-grade ore that had the mining engineer practically dancing with excitement. By Christmas, the mine was turning a steady profit, and Mason used some of the proceeds to buy adjoining land, doubling the size of Mesquite Creek's grazing area. The new year of 1879 arrived with unexpected news. Tess was expecting a child. The knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Her own mother had died in childbirth, and Tess had never imagined herself as a mother. "What if I'm not good at it?" she asked Mason one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "What if I don't know how to love a child properly?" "You love with your whole heart, Tess," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I've seen how you care for everyone at Mesquite Creek, how you remember Tomas's youngest daughter's birthday, how you taught Mrs. Ortiz's grandson to read, how you make sure the men have warm clothes for winter. You already know how to love." His certainty calmed her fears, and as her body changed with the passing months, Tess found herself embracing the idea of motherhood. She sewed tiny garments, read books on infant care, and listened attentively to Mrs. Ortiz's advice on everything from relieving morning sickness to predicting the baby's gender from the shape of her belly. "A boy," Mrs. Ortiz declared with absolute confidence. "See how you carry low and round. Definitely a boy." Mason smiled indulgently, but insisted he would be equally happy with a daughter. "A little girl with your eyes and spirit. What could be more perfect?" Summer arrived, bringing with it sweltering heat that made Tess's advanced pregnancy even more uncomfortable. She took to spending the hottest hours in the cool darkness of the root cellar, where Mason had set up a comfortable chair and small table for her. It was there, on a scorching August afternoon, that Tess felt the first pains begin. Mrs. Ortiz sent one of the ranch hands galloping for the midwife in Silver Bend, while she helped Tess to bed and prepared for the birth. Mason paced outside the bedroom door, white-faced and terrified in a way that the hardships of ranch life had never made him. When Tess's cries intensified, he burst into the room despite Mrs. Ortiz's protests. "I need to be with her," he insisted, taking Tess's hand as another contraction gripped her. "I won't get in the way." Through hours of pain and exhaustion, Mason remained at her side, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement, his strength flowing into her when her own faltered. Just as dawn broke over the eastern hills, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to proclaim his readiness for life. "Look what we made," Tess whispered as the midwife placed the swaddled infant in her arms. Tears streamed down her face as she gazed at the tiny, perfect features, Mason's strong chin, her own high cheekbones. Mason's voice was thick with emotion as he touched the baby's downy head. "He's beautiful, just like his mother." They named him Thomas Michael Blackwood, Thomas for Tomas, who had helped save the ranch by recognizing the silver potential, and Michael for Mason's father. Life with a newborn transformed Mesquite Creek once again. The rhythms of feeding and changing and soothing became as natural to Tess as breathing. She discovered reserves of patience she hadn't known she possessed, and a fierce, protective love that sometimes overwhelmed her with its intensity. Mason proved to be a devoted father, insisting on taking his share of night duties, and often carrying Thomas in a sling as he went about his ranch chores. The sight of her tall, rugged husband cradling their tiny son never failed to make Tess's heart swell with love and gratitude. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the Silverado mine continued to produce enough silver to make Mesquite Creek one of the most prosperous operations in the territory. Mason used the wealth wisely, investing in better breeding stock for the ranch and modern equipment for the mine, but also setting aside funds for Thomas's education and future. In the spring of 1881, when Thomas was nearing his second birthday, a letter arrived from Silver Bend that cast a shadow over their happiness. Theodore Hammond, the banker who had once tried to foreclose on Mesquite Creek, had been found dead in his office, apparently murdered. The sheriff was investigating, and rumors pointed to Donovan's gang, who had been quiet for too long. Hammond must have crossed them somehow, Mason said as he and Tess discussed the news after Thomas was asleep. But I don't like it, Tess, if Donovan is back in the area. He might come looking for me, Tess finished, voicing the fear they both shared. Despite their happiness and success, the threat of her past had never entirely disappeared. Mason's expression hardened. I won't let him near you or Thomas. I promise you that. They doubled the watch at the ranch, and Mason rarely traveled without at least 2 armed men accompanying him. For weeks, they lived in a state of tense vigilance, jumping at unexpected sounds and scanning the horizon for riders. The attack, when it came, was not what they had expected. It began with fire. 3 of the outlying pasture fences set ablaze simultaneously in the middle of the night. As the ranch hands rushed to contain the fires, Donovan and his men struck at the main house. Tess was awakened by gunshots and the sound of breaking glass. Mason was already out of bed, pulling on his clothes and checking his revolver. Get Thomas and hide in the root cellar, he ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos. Don't come out until I come for you personally. Tess didn't waste time arguing. She snatched Thomas from his bed, grateful that her son remained deeply asleep despite the noise. Clutching him to her chest, she fled down the back stairs and out through the kitchen to the root cellar behind the house. The heavy wooden door closed behind them with a solid thunk, plunging them into darkness until Tess managed to light the lantern she kept there. Thomas stirred and whimpered, sensing his mother's fear. Hush, my love, she soothed, rocking him gently. Everything will be all right. Above them, the sounds of shouting and gunfire continued. Tess found herself praying, really praying, not just going through the motions as she had in her father's church, for Mason's safety and for the protection of everyone at Mesquite Creek. Time stretched endlessly in the close darkness of the cellar. Thomas eventually fell back asleep, his warm weight a comfort against Tess's racing heart. She strained to hear what was happening above, but the thick walls muffled all but the loudest sounds. When the cellar door finally opened, Tess raised Mason's spare revolver, her finger tense on the trigger. But it was Mason himself who appeared, bloodied but alive. It's over, he said, helping her up the steps. Donovan's dead, 2 of his men with him. In the pale light of dawn, Tess surveyed the damage to their home. Windows shattered, furniture overturned, bullet holes peppering the walls. But the structure stood firm, and more importantly, their family remained intact. Tomas approached, his arm in a makeshift sling. Senor Blackwood, the sheriff from Silver Bend, is here. He wants to speak with you and the senora. Sheriff Ellis was a tall man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much violence. He listened gravely as Mason explained the night's events and the history with Donovan's gang. I've been after Donovan for the Hammond murder, the sheriff said when Mason finished. Looks like you saved the territory the cost of a trial. He turned to Tess. Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you had previous dealings with these men. Tess's arms tightened around Thomas. Yes. They killed a man I was traveling with in Sierra Falls 3 years ago and held me captive briefly before I escaped. The sheriff nodded, making notes in a small book. Well, you won't have to worry about them anymore. Donovan's dead, and I'm taking the surviving gang member back to Silver Bend to stand trial. After the sheriff left, Mason and Tess stood in the wreckage of their front room, surveying the damage in the clear light of day. "We'll rebuild," Mason said, his arm around her shoulders. "Make it better than before." Tess looked up at him, this man who had saved her in more ways than she could count. "We always do." The rebuilding of Mesquite Creek became a community effort. Neighbors from miles around arrived with tools and supplies, working alongside the ranch hands to repair the damage. Even Mrs. Ortiz's extended family came from as far as Tucson to help, turning the reconstruction into something like a celebration. By Christmas, the house was not only repaired but improved, with a larger kitchen for Mrs. Ortiz, a proper study for Mason's business dealings, and a small library filled with books for Thomas's education. Tess insisted on adding a second bedroom for the child she suspected was already growing inside her, though she hadn't yet shared this news with Mason. On Christmas Eve, with Thomas finally asleep after the excitement of hanging his stocking, Tess and Mason sat before the fire in their rebuilt home. Outside, a rare snow fell softly, dusting the desert landscape with white. "I have something for you," Mason said, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to wait until morning, but I'm not sure I can." He handed her a small velvet box. Inside lay a silver locket, exquisitely crafted with tiny flowers etched into its surface. When Tess opened it, she found a miniature portrait of Thomas on one side and Mason on the other. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "Thank you." "There's room for more portraits," Mason said, his eyes twinkling. "Should we need them?" Tess smiled, placing her hand over her still flat stomach. "We might need them sooner than you think." Mason's expression shifted from confusion to dawning joy. "Are you saying in early summer if Mrs. Ortiz's calculations are correct?" Tess laughed as Mason lifted her from her chair and spun her around, his face alight with happiness. "Another child," he marveled, setting her gently back on her feet. "Our family is growing, our family." Tess savored the words, still sometimes amazed by how far she had come from that desperate woman staggering through the desert. "I never thought I would have this, Mason. A home, children, someone who loves me for myself, not for what I could do for them." Mason drew her close, his arms warm and secure around her. "You deserve all of it and more, Tess Blackwood, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that again." As the snow fell and the fire crackled, Tess rested her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, the vast Arizona territory stretched in all directions, wild and beautiful and sometimes dangerous. But here, in this home they had built together, she had found what she had always sought without knowing it, not just safety or security, but belonging. True, deep belonging. In May of 1882, their daughter, Elizabeth Rose Blackwood, was born amid the wildflowers that carpeted the ranch after spring rains. Unlike Thomas's difficult birth, Elizabeth arrived quickly and easily, as if eager to join their family. She had Tess's auburn hair and, to everyone's delight, Mason's deep blue eyes. With two small children and a prosperous ranch to manage, the days passed in a blur of joyful chaos. Tess sometimes marveled at how completely her life had transformed from a desperate survivor to a mother, wife, and respected businesswoman, whose opinion was sought by ranchers and merchants throughout the territory. The Silverado mine continued to produce, though the richest veins were gradually being exhausted. Mason, with Tess's encouragement, diversified their investments, purchasing shares in the railroad being built through Silver Bend, and establishing a small but successful breeding program for horses suited to the harsh desert environment. By the time Thomas was ready for formal schooling, Mesquite Creek had grown large enough to support its own schoolhouse, with a proper teacher brought from Boston. Other families settled nearby, drawn by the prosperity and stability the Blackwoods had created, until a small community formed around the original ranch. Through it all, Mason and Tess remained partners in every sense, their love deepening with each challenge overcome and each joy shared. The frightened, mistrustful woman Tess had once been seemed like a character in someone else's story, remembered, but no longer present. On their 10th anniversary, Mason surprised Tess with a journey to San Francisco, their first real vacation since their marriage. They left Thomas and Elizabeth in Mrs. Ortiz's capable care and traveled by the newly completed railroad, marveling at the speed and comfort compared to the days of stagecoaches and horseback. San Francisco dazzled them with its sophistication and energy. They stayed in a grand hotel, ate in fine restaurants, attended the opera, and walked arm in arm along the bustling waterfront. Mason bought Tess silk dresses and jewels that she protested were too extravagant but secretly adored. On their last night in the city, as they stood on their hotel balcony watching the fog roll in from the bay, Mason wrapped his arms around Tess from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked. Tess leaned back against him, savoring his warmth and strength. "Completely. Though I miss the children. We'll bring them next time," Mason promised. "When Elizabeth is a bit older. Thomas would love the ships in the harbor." "Do you ever wonder," Tess asked quietly, "what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day in the desert?" Mason was silent for a moment. "I try not to. The thought of you out there alone." He tightened his arms around her. "I believe some things are meant to be, Tess. You and me, our children, our life together, it was all waiting for us to find each other. Even though I came with such a past. Even though I was used and cast away so many times before you." Mason turned her gently to face him, his expression serious in the silvery fog light. "Especially because of that. Everything you experienced made you the woman I fell in love with, strong, resilient, compassionate. I wouldn't change a single thing about you or your past, because all of it brought you to me." Tess rose on tiptoe to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. "Take me to bed, Mason Blackwood," she whispered against his lips. "I want to show you exactly how happy you make me." Later, as they lay tangled in the hotel's luxurious sheets, Tess marveled at how desire between them had only deepened with time. 10 years of marriage had not dimmed their passion, but enriched it, adding layers of intimacy and understanding that made each touch more meaningful. "I have something to tell you," she said, tracing patterns on Mason's chest. "I was going to wait until we got home, but—" Mason propped himself up on one elbow, his expression curious. "What is it?" "Elizabeth is going to have a little brother or sister. In the winter." Joy bloomed across Mason's face. "Another child. Tess, that's wonderful." As he gathered her into his arms, Tess felt the familiar surge of gratitude that had become part of her daily life. From desperate beginnings had come this abundance of love and family, this richness of purpose and belonging. Their third child, James William Blackwood, was born on a cold December night in 1888, with snow drifting past the windows and a fire blazing in the bedroom hearth. At 6, Elizabeth was fascinated by her new brother, while 10-year-old Thomas attempted to maintain a dignified interest befitting his status as the eldest. By then, Mesquite Creek had grown into something approaching a small town, with the schoolhouse, a general store, and even a small church where services were held whenever a preacher passed through. The original ranch house had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing family and frequent guests, though Mason and Tess made sure it retained the warmth and character that had made it a true home. In the spring of 1890, as Tess approached her 40th birthday, a letter arrived that reopened a chapter of her life she had long considered closed. It was from William's sister in St. Louis, a woman Tess had never met, but who had somehow tracked her down. "William spoke of you often in his letters," the woman wrote. "He was not a good man in many ways, but I believe he cared for you as much as he was capable of caring for anyone. Before he left for Arizona that last time, he entrusted me with something to give to you if anything happened to him. I have only recently learned of your whereabouts and marriage. I hope this finds you well and happy." Enclosed with the letter was a small leather pouch containing a gold wedding band and a faded photograph of a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Tess. "My mother," Tess whispered, recognizing the face from her own dim memories. She had been only 5 when her mother died, and her father had destroyed all images of his wife in his grief. Mason found her sitting on the porch, staring at the photograph with tears streaming down her face. Wordlessly, he sat beside her, offering his presence without demands. "I never told you much about my mother," Tess said after a while. "She was kind, I remember that, and she sang to me every night. After she died, there was no more music in our house." Mason took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "She gave the world a magnificent gift in you, Tess. I wish I could thank her." Tess leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "I thought I had left everything from before behind. But this having her face again, it feels like recovering a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." "The past is never really gone," Mason said gently. "It becomes part of the foundation we build our lives on. The good and the bad, all of it matters." That night, Tess added her mother's photograph to the family album that chronicled the Blackwoods' history. It seemed right that the woman who had given Tess life should have a place in the record of the life Tess had built. As the 19th century drew to a close, bringing with it new inventions and ideas that transformed the territory, Mesquite Creek remained a haven of stability and prosperity. Thomas, now 21, had returned from university in California with modern notions about cattle breeding and range management that sometimes clashed with his father's traditional methods. Their good-natured debates around the dinner table became a family ritual that Tess moderated with amused diplomacy. Elizabeth, at 18, had her father's quiet strength and her mother's sharp intelligence. She had recently announced her intention to attend medical school, a shocking ambition for a young woman, but one that her parents supported wholeheartedly. Little James, not so little at 11, showed signs of becoming a skilled horseman and had already declared his intention to expand the Blackwood horse breeding program when he grew up. On a warm evening in September 1899, as the century prepared to turn, Mason and Tess sat on the porch of Mesquite Creek Ranch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Gray threaded Mason's dark hair now, and fine lines marked the corners of Tess's eyes, but they remained as connected as they had been on that first desperate day in the desert. "You remember what you said to me when you found me?" Tess asked, her hand resting comfortably in his. "That first day when I was barely conscious," Mason smiled, the memory clear despite the passing years. "I said I would keep you, forever if need be." "You've kept that promise," Tess said softly, "even when I didn't believe anyone could." "It was the easiest promise I've ever made," Mason replied, lifting her hand to his lips, "and the one I've been happiest to keep." As darkness settled over the land they had tamed and loved together, Tess Blackwood, once used and cast away, now cherished and essential, rested her head on her husband's shoulder and watched the first stars appear in the vast Arizona sky. Forever, it seemed, was just beginning.